Hello and welcome to the Colts Cover-2 podcast. I am Joel A. Erickson. I'm joined, as always, by Nate Atkins. We got a little bit of football yesterday and a lot of Jim Irsay remembrance from the current team, from Shane Steichen and Reggie Wayne and several players. I don't know, from a football standpoint, we only saw one practice, Nate, and outside of Tyler Warren looking very capable and fast, I don't know if I have a huge takeaway from that practice.
Yeah, I mean, these are hard because, obviously they're not fully padded practices anyway, but we also get to see one a week. So we're just seeing the one day we happen to step in and get to see. So I try to keep myself from drawing too many conclusions until at least we can string together a mix of the OTA practices with the veteran mini camp, and across the course of that, in maybe a little bit of rookie mini camp for some of these guys. Across the course of that, I think you get a few initial impressions. So Tyler Warren, he stood out that same way at the rookie mini camp. Just looked like a big dude who can go up and get the ball and also get down the field. Just a different mix of things than they've had at tight end. So that was evident yesterday. I try not to read too much into the quarterback play. I think that's best to wait on anyway, because that'll be every waking moment of our training camp coverage. But also, yesterday was not the day to. Yesterday was not a banner day for either guy either, but Anthony Richardson or Daniel Jones. But it also was, like I said, it's one day out of the week we get to watch. So I don't know. It's kind of interesting to see them out there and just you get some updates on kind of where guys are physically and with their health. But as far as learning like real football specific stuff, that's pretty difficult.
Yeah. I think if you want to, you can take observations away from those practices. I tend to wait until training camp to really dive in the way I have in the past, or the way we usually do with observations. It's just you're trying to read too much into what's a small sample size, and we don't fully have everything. I thought the more interesting stuff yesterday was the team remembering Jim Irsay, and I'm just going to start with, I think that the obvious person to start with is Reggie Wayne. He knew him the longest. It's a 25-year relationship for those two. Wayne, as a player, and then now as a coach, obviously the in-between part where Reggie was around the team but not working for the team. We've seen after Irsay's death, we saw a lot of former players talking about their relationship with him. But the thing that stuck out to me, and probably you too, is just I'm not used to seeing Reggie Wayne uncomfortable in an interview setting, and he was visibly emotional yesterday.
Yeah, it was going to be an interesting day just to see how they talk through and process some of this. The Colts brought out the players that they thought kind of had spent the most time around Jim Irsay, and also were guys that tend to be kind of most ready for a moment like this to speak publicly on a somewhat difficult topic, a non-football specific topic. So, they brought out DeForest Buckner and Michael Pittman Jr. and Tyquan Lewis and Kenny Moore. And those are great choices, but those were, they got to see that as a kind of players, like their whole relationship to Jim Irsay was as players for the team that he runs. And so there was a closeness there, but you saw a totally different side out of Reggie Wayne, who's kind of seen it on a lot of different levels, from a draft pick who got picked up in a helicopter ride with Jim Irsay to, becoming a player who spent, a decade and a half here on the only team he's ever played for. And then, going beyond that to being inducted into the Ring of Honor, and then coming back as an assistant coach. And you just form a different relationship once you're not, in the building every day, but also once you're kind of in that kind of category of Colts player that's legendary. And those are always the ones that Jim Irsay, while he's close to everyone in the building on a level that's more than most owners, I think it's easy to see that those star players, those long-term foundational players, post-playing career, tend to have the closest relationships. So it's not a surprise that Reggie Wayne was the most emotional or the most moved by talking about Jim Irsay, but it was still jarring to see for a guy who's usually, so in control and so, humorous and so kind of light-hearted about a lot of things when he is talking, to just straight up break down and really have a hard time getting through a couple of moments talking about the man that Jim Irsay was and the connection that he had to players and people in the building and the city, and just the ways that he tried to. It really started when he broke down. He was talking about telling his receivers room about Jim Irsay and realizing that a lot of them didn't really know the Jim Irsay that he knew, and most people will talk about at this time because it makes sense. You think about it, Jim Irsay the past couple of years has been a different version of him. He's been the one that, he had the health scare, was that late in the 2023 season, and then really was not visible last year really at all, outside of a couple of, he really wasn't mobile at all. He was not nearly as involved. And that just shows you how quickly things move. Where AD Mitchell's a rookie last year. Josh Downs was in his second season last year. Alec Pierce got here the year before. That was probably the edge of Irsay's kind of involved levels. And that's just how it is. So a lot of the guys on the roster don't know the Jim Irsay that Reggie Wayne did, the one that you read so much about in the obits and in a lot of these memories, the big time philanthropist, the ultimate team cheerleader, the guy that's just kind of throwing events all the time and also being very hands-on with football and getting to know the players and being present all the time. And so that's been Reggie Wayne's entire existence with Jim Irsay. It's now gone on 25 years, and just kind of realizing that he's gone and that you have to just share about this person in your words, and you hope you do him justice. That's kind of the weight I felt from Reggie as he was talking, and it was powerful to see that a guy who's so in control, so humorous, so lighthearted at a podium all of a sudden is kind of is just broken down by this moment and this finality and this circumstance. And I thought that kind of really showcased the connection that Jim Irsay has with his players. And it's not how, former players, assistant coaches, current players, and anybody around the league, that's not how they often will talk about an owner, even when they are saddened by their passing, even when they do recognize how important they were. That personal connection was very easy to see with Reggie.
Yeah, I thought it was interesting. We kind of knew about the former players. I thought it was interesting how emotional Shane Steichen was. Steichen, by his personality, tends to be kind of reserved, or not reserved. I would say he's forward thinking. He's not really reflective in press conferences. He's usually kind of just moving through them. He was really emotional, right away, talking about Irsay. And, he's only been with him 2 years, but you think about all the conversations that they had to have. He said, they talk after every game, the 4.5-hour conversation at the start, in the interview process. And he's the guy that gave him a shot in the NFL. Where they talk about how special those jobs are, one of 32. Just an interesting. I think the last time we saw Shane visibly emotional was his introductory press conference, right?
Yeah, probably the only other time, honestly. But I don't think that's a coincidence. I think those two things are probably linked. I was just saying, I think those two things are probably linked in what you said about how Jim Irsay gave him his shot. And so the last time we saw him emotional was
I agree.
And so, that was surprising too. I mean, I thought, I knew Shane would come out and address the situation and have, important things to say, but you did feel that emotion. He's just not a coach you feel that particular emotion from. There's times with Shane you feel, adrenaline and excitement, and that's kind of his peak for him. There's other times where, he's very, cut to the chase, business-like, but this was the first time he's real reflective and kind of moved by something. First time since that introductory presser. And I think it just kind of goes back to, this is a guy living his dream, And not always do we get to see him kind of step back and think about that or reflect on that because he is so dialed in on, next play call, next practice, all that kind of stuff. But when it does happen, when there are moments where you have to sit in that, with whether that's the introductory press conference for your first ever head coaching job or this moment of, saying goodbye to the person who gave you that opportunity. That's where you saw Shane was fully human in that way, and that was something to see too. And I think it probably does go back to leading into that first introductory presser. Remember how long those interview processes were. The Colts strung that out about as long as you'd ever see, and they had, I think, like 3 rounds of interviews with Shane and the finalists by the end. And we know how Jim Irsay is in really any time he would talk to anybody for any amount of time. Like it's a fully immersive type of conversation that just kind of goes and goes and goes and goes and goes. And he ended up, I remember Jim Irsay saying at that press conference, introductory presser, that Shane stood out because of those interviews and how just sort of like he met him on his football intensity level, his love of the game. So there clearly was something between them that clicked in that way. Jim Irsay, as we've talked about, the football historian nerd, NFL history nerd, and Shane, he's the kind of the new age, much younger, but he's a full-on football nerd too. Loves kind of everything about the sport and how it's gotten to this place too. And so they clearly had a connection that I thought, I guess we always kind of knew about, but I thought yesterday brought forth that like there's more here than just a business arrangement too. Is that they really connected in those interviews that made Shane the head coach in the first place, and it led to a moment, yesterday and this past week that made it for Shane, tough to say goodbye.
Yeah. The current players, guys like Kenny Moore, DeForest Buckner, Tyquan Lewis, for me, though, their remembrances were sort of just an ongoing, a furthering of what we've heard about Irsay already from a lot of different corners. Just everyone had a moment. For Buckner, it was when he got hurt last year and he wanted to fly to Panama to get treatment on his ankle. And the Irsays flew him down there. For Kenny Moore, it was a death in the family. Irsay way to get him down there, even on a work day. For Tyquan Lewis, it was the little like remembrances and gifts after he was injured. And for Michael Pittman Jr., it was the stuff in the post-game locker room that we've all kind of gotten to see. We've seen the edited version on Colts.com of the locker room after, but we haven't necessarily seen the same thing in like we don't get to see all of it. Shane kind of alluded to that when he said his best story about Irsay. He couldn't tell because there's some profanity there. And some of those celebratory things that happen in the locker room, I think they probably don't put out, So that's all different. It's all of them are linked and all of them are a little bit different, but he had a way of touching a lot of people's lives in one way or the other that was memorable. You and I have both covered teams with different owners. I've covered one, you've covered two. I don't remember, the same kind of stories when coming around the Benson family in New Orleans. I don't know what your experience was in Detroit and Chicago, but I don't remember them. I don't remember the ownership having quite as expansive a relationship with the players and a one-on-one relationship with the players.
Yeah, I haven't been around it on this level of, what stood out with Jim Irsay, hearing those stories from Reggie, obviously, and the current players is there's a mix of like with all of them, he really connected on like a football level and like loved them as players and could speak their language. And, he's sat there in the general manager seat. So he knows what a lot of what it takes to find the right skill sets, build the right team. It's more than just a business to him, but like on Reggie's level, and we heard a little bit more of this, some of the stuff with how he helped out Tyquan Lewis and when he was dealing with injuries and Kenny Moore, when he had a death in the family, there is a little bit more on a personal level that some of them would compare to like a father figure relationship. And so part of it's different. The two I've covered were female owners. And so that's a different dynamic in its own way. But they were, females in their 90s who they just weren't going to have that kind of a relationship with many players. For them, it was very much a couple players, maybe the star quarterback. I think Matthew Stafford had a little bit more of a relationship because he was kind of the front-facing player for the Lions. Martha Ford was there a lot in the building, but that was just kind of, she'd say hi, she'd speak to the team on occasion. To actually get a personal connection with an owner is rare. It's just not. We can't say it doesn't happen anywhere else, because I think one of the things like this is brought out. I think you see a lot of national reactions to Reggie breaking down and some of the other stuff, that people nationally are realizing that Jim Irsay was a super big figure with individual people in a way that they didn't realize, that there's more than just the kind of rock star character type, eccentric person he was. That's how he's kind of been known the last few years, and some of that was fair. I mean, he certainly did some silly stuff over the past few years that hurt his image and didn't have him in as good of a standing as a successful owner as he had been previously. But that connection is so kind of pure and sustained, and that I think a lot of people on the outside are seeing, and they're realizing that just you don't really get that when owners die. I mean, it's happened a few times just over the past decade. I know you mentioned, like, you covered one in New Orleans, but usually when these happen, of course, it's monumental, it's newsworthy, everyone's got something to say just about. Usually it's about their impact on the city. A lot of them have some version of the generosity that someone can talk about. Very rarely do they get to very personal type of situations. Very, very, so many of these guys had, like, what struck me yesterday is how everyone had their own anecdote. So it was more than just sort of this general talk about, oh, we all know how generous he is and all this. Like, we've referenced a few of them already, but like Reggie Wayne sharing about how Jim Irsay was the one to call him before he went on free agent visits before his last contract, and just said, like, you're not getting on that plane and I'm keeping you here. And they ironed out a deal without using an agent. That's different than what a lot of owners would do. Kenny Moore mentioned that he had like a death in the family and wasn't sure how to get away, and Jim Irsay made travel arrangements to make sure he could get there. And that's an owner stepping in and doing that. Whereas a lot of owners, I think, are almost too detached from even knowing a player like that, who's not maybe the quarterback, to even know or care enough about that kind of a situation to do that. Tyquan Lewis sharing about how he'd get bottles of wine and cards from the Irsays when he was in rehab dealing with the injuries. Forrest Buckner, like you mentioned, getting flown down to Panama for treatment from the Irsay. So it just kind of goes. He's found a way to make it personal to everybody. I think the other, also the ways he did that they saw with other people. Tyquan Lewis shared about how, like, Jim Irsay had a moment, honoring the groundskeeper at the Colts facility. So that's just kind of those things that they get to witness and experience. Just go beyond just things that are nice but aren't personal, like writing checks and giving a lot of money or just talking to the team, which Jim Irsay did all that too. But that's more like what you would associate with other owners, where you can speak kind of broadly about, hey, they did these good things. But a lot of owners, and I know I've talked to players of the Bears and Lions, they didn't know if the owner knew their name. They were there for now, and they're going to be gone. They've owned the team for a long time. It's just like with Jim Irsay, I don't think a lot of players, if they spent a real amount of time here, I feel like they all felt like he knew their name and he knew their backstory, and sometimes he knew their family situations in ways that they didn't know about until the time came for a tragedy. And it's those type of personal connections that have made it different. Like Tyquan Lewis said it, like, I know he's referring to, coming from Ohio State, they put a ton of people in the NFL. He said he's heard horror stories about how other owners act. And, that kind of set his expectation for Indy. And then the Irsay family is always something different. And so, that's not to say that the Irsays were perfect or Jim Irsay is perfect, didn't have problems. There are times when players took issue with Irsay, back in 2022 when he got too involved and kind of threw their season out of whack before, just kind of threw it up in flames. But on a personal level, in the way that the culture, the way that played out for them to actually kind of live a day-to-day life here, I think they felt something different from him than I think a lot of players would say from their owners.
Yeah, and I think one of the other things that stuck out to me is that going forward, I think this locker room feels that there's already a connection with Carly, Irsay Gordon, with Kalen Jackson. Not so much with Casey Foyt because she's not in the building as much as the other two are. But they definitely know her. They know all three of them. I think we can probably say that we see them in the locker room all the time during the season, talking to players and, checking in on them, different holidays, that kind of thing. Carly is always at the building. Her blue Range Rover is very easy to spot, so it's easy to know when she's there. And I think that's one of the things that the question that we asked a lot yesterday was something along the lines of, what do you see of their father in the daughters that are taking over right now? And a lot of the players, their response was, they're around the team. We know them. Taekwon Lewis said his relationship with Carly has grown and changed and matured over the years. That's not true for a lot of owners and players, especially a player like Taekwon, who, has been here for a long time, is not necessarily a star, has never really been a full-time starter. So, the relationship, they feel like they already know who's taking over. And I think a lot of times when there's a death, when an owner passes, there's uncertainty there for who's going to take over, what's going to take over. From all we know and from what the Colts seem to know, they know who's taking over and they already have a relationship with them and trust them.
Yeah, I think Carly Irsay Gordon's presence on game day is a big factor. They talked about it. She's there on the sideline wearing a headset, but she's also trying to engage with the players. A lot of fist bumps and small conversations, and trying to be someone involved. And that's not always how it goes. Very, very rarely how it goes actually with like a member of ownership doing that. So there's a mix of that, and then some of them who've gotten very involved with the Kicking the Stigma initiative have gotten to know Kalen Jackson. She's taken a real pride in the players on a personal level and their personal growth and all of that. And so when they build around foundational players, some of the individuals they had talk yesterday, who've been here for several years, that ends up kind of building a connection. But it is kind of interesting to hear, though, that I feel like they feel like they know Carly, and they feel like they are in the know as far as kind of where things are going, which is an interesting contrast to like the outside world, is that we've really never heard from Carly, and we have not really gotten a sense for a firm sense of where this is going. Now, between what they're saying and just the way that it seems set up, the involvement that we do know that the daughters have, it's not hard to deduce where some things are going to go. So it's not as in the dark as, certainly situations where there's been disagreements or just complete unknown with an owner dying. That has happened before, but it is interesting that like Carly specifically has taken a total in-house immersive approach with players, coaches, front office members, in a way that's so different than her public persona, which is basically nothing outside of when we see her with that headset on in the sideline. And so I'm just curious to see as we go forward if they merge those two better, if they close that gap, or if this will always be a sort of one of those things that just happens where the person in the building is just so different than what we know about them in a public way, even in a situation like this where the team in the sport are, the number one thing in the NFL, number one thing in sports, number one thing, it's such a public facing role, but sometimes people tend to take that privately. Jim Irsay never did. So I'm just curious to see how they grow within that. But it is, if you're a Colts fan, you're kind of wondering how stable things are or where this is going. I do think you have to be encouraged hearing the players feel confident about that. They know the daughters of the owner, the people who are next in line. They feel like those people both know them as people and they know them as football players. That was what Jim Irsay ultimately brought, that formed a lot of these connections, was having both of those. They feel like that's there and that they've seen it play out over several years here. So that's something good to see. But yeah, we're just kind of at the beginning of the transition now. And so I'm curious to see if they flesh it out more for the rest of us.
Yeah, I know you've probably gotten a lot of questions. I know I've gotten a lot of questions from people. What does this mean for the future of the team? What does this mean for Chris Ballard? What does this mean for Shane Steichen? What does this mean for the quarterbacks? We don't know. We don't know, and I don't really know that anybody does at this point. Carly Irsay Gordon has not done a lot of sessions in interviews. We've all talked to Kaylin quite a bit, but usually on her turf, in the philanthropy space. We don't know what they think about the future of the team, and I really think there's not really anything that can give us a guess either. You can try to read it a lot of different ways based on what you think. Carly trained under her father. She probably feels the same way he does. You could look at it as, this is her time to make a change. Maybe she's been wanting to. You can guess at all that stuff. We don't know any of it. We have no idea really what she wants to do with the organization. And they're grieving right now. My understanding is we're not going to hear from them probably through at least the end of next week. At some point, the fan base is going to want to hear from the new owners where they stand. Is it business as usual? Is it does this change the tenor? I think we'll get there at some point. It's just not going to happen right now. And I honestly think that unless somebody out there has got an interview I don't know about, I just don't think we know. I don't think we have an inkling of where they lean, where the daughters lean on the football side of it, the stuff that most people care about, the wins and losses and who's running the team and who's in charge of it. We don't know.
Yeah, it's going to create an interesting wrinkle once we, eventually move past sort of the shock of this moment and the grieving portion in the memory stage, which will, extend into next week. They're going to have the memorial service, private memorial service, and then at some point have a more public version. So this is, and then they're going to go into that NFL kind of quiet period where there's, post-veteran minicamp, pre-training camp. So it's going to take a little time, but at some point, yeah, those are when we get to training camp, and especially as we get to the start of the season, there's going to be a moment where the page flips to football and this team and what they're trying to accomplish now and what's at stake for moving forward. And where ownership stands is huge on that. And I don't have a lot of the answers to that yet. It's one of those where even it was a little hard before this because we hadn't heard a lot from Jim Irsay in recent years. In fact, I believe we'd only talked to him once for about 10 minutes at training camp last year. That's probably about it in the last year and a half. But you could deduce through action or inaction, previous stances he's had that have not changed or led to action. You could kind of read where he was. We knew he loved Chris Ballard. We knew he really thought he found a star there, and that the Andrew Luck retirement just kind of was a tough wrinkle in there, and just likes his general approach. And we knew they shared a philosophy on drafting and developing and retaining players and mostly keeping things in-house. We knew that he fell in love with Shane Steichen's kind of energy and charisma on a football level, football obsession. That extended to when he was on the broadcast. That is one other time we would hear from Jim Irsay is on the preseason broadcast, and he just last year compared Shane Steichen to Don Shula. So like we got hints like that. We don't know with Carly what any of this. I mean, she could be right in lockstep with her dad and just follow all of that. Or like you said, she could be, maybe she's had a different perspective. The thing is that like until this happened, like Jim Irsay was the sole owner. He was so Carly and Caitlin had their roles within the franchise, but as far as making decisions on quarterback, head coach, general manager, it all stopped in the same place. And now it's going to stop in a different place. And so it's going to create a lot of, I don't know, intrigue and unknown with this season until we get those answers, because this is a year that was supposed to build up to be a make or break season, certainly for Anthony Richardson, but you would think to some level for Shane Steichen and Chris Ballard, but we also had that hanging out there where Chris Ballard's been here for so long. Jim Irsay keeps finding reasons to kind of want to keep this going. I don't know if this makes this much more of a make or break year now that Jim Irsay isn't the one making that decision, or who knows, or maybe it's so new that they'll be reticent to blow something up, 6 months after taking over for the first time as owners. I really don't know where they're going to land on any of that. I do think it makes it interesting in that way to think through how they go about it. And you wonder how firm of answers do Shane and Chris have on that? Like, do they for sure know where they stand with Carly on this type of level when she has not had that authority until the past week to actually hold those keys over them the way that her dad did for as long as they've been here. So does that, and you never know. I mean, sometimes that can play into how people do things. You think about like they're going to decide who starts at quarterback week 1, and that could be a conversation between the long-term upside, chasing upside, on a smaller percentage chance that it works with Anthony Richardson versus going with something a little safer in Daniel Jones, but doesn't maybe move the needle, in a way that inspires hope as a contender. I don't know. These are all the questions that we'll go through. I hope at some point we get more than just questions, because that's all I have right now is I just have all these questions about it, because that's that hard shift when you go from one person who had very defined ways of doing things in Jim Irsay to now this is the shift, and this is where it's going to be. Could be the same, could be different, but we don't really know.
One thing we do know is that Carly has been preparing for this. And I was thinking about this. I read a couple stories online when I was writing my story last night. There are a lot of NFL owners that do not do any sort of formal football training before they take over a team. Like you think about David Tepper or Josh Harris or those guys who've just bought teams recently. A lot of those guys were just coming from the business world. In Harris's case, he owns another professional sports franchise, which on the one hand does give you some experience, but on the other hand doesn't give you football experience. The NFL works differently than the NBA, works differently than MLB, works differently than the Premier League. So whatever your ownership is, it's not quite the same. Carly has on the job, in meetings, on the sideline with the headset on, at practice, talking to players, learning scheme, all that stuff. She has all that training. That doesn't guarantee success. It doesn't guarantee success at all. But it was one of the things that I was shy is there was an ESPN article in January about why owners head coaching hires wrong. And one of the elements that came out of it was that coaches don't feel like owners know what they want in a football coach because they don't know the game. And so then they get to a point where they have to hire somebody and they don't really have a blueprint or a desire or anything. I think Philadelphia's Jeff Lurie is the only one, at least according to the ESPN article, can sit down and tell someone, this is definitively what I want from a football standpoint. Irsay had a football background. He was a GM for a long time. His success level at the Colts, drafting Peyton Manning, building Lucas Oil getting Lucas Oil Stadium built, taking the team from the dregs of the NFL into something that people care about, that kind of stuff, than it is his performance as general manager or his knowledge of the day-to-day football. All that being said, though, I think Jim Irsay knew what he wanted in a head coach, usually. And they haven't been as successful as they wanted to be, but they give themselves from being. I think that'd be one of those teams that really can't find its way. Is that he had a defined bent for the franchise, a defined goal for the franchise. But yeah, I think that's one of the things that sticks out to me. It's just she has on-the-job training. She has football thoughts from everything we've been told. So we'll have to see what that means and how that plays out. Like we've been saying, we'll find that out whenever we get a chance to get to know them a little bit more.
Yeah, and I mean, if you look across ownership in the NFL, in sports in general, I mean, there's times when like not everyone has to be a football junkie, has to be super involved. There's talk about how some better owners learn to stay out of it, and so it's all a mix of things. I do think it's better to have than not to have. So I do think it'd be encouraged that Charlie grew up in that and taking a role in that, and we'll see where it goes. It's a new era. We're going to learn it the same way as everybody else.
Yeah, I mean, and you can know everything about a sport and not be good at owning a team. And I have two very easy examples for that. Michael Jordan in basketball, Derek Jeter in baseball, all-time greats, not great executives.
Yeah.
So, there's an element of that that's overblown, We'll find out. We're going to find out. We're starting to learn some stuff. The meeting with the players yesterday, that was a window into some stuff with Carly and Kaylin that we didn't know before. I'm expecting to learn some stuff. Media isn't allowed at the memorial in the memorial service, but we are going to be there, or I'm going to be there. And usually in these cases, other owners talk. We'll learn some stuff there. We're learning. We're going to learn who the daughters really are and how they want to run this team. We're going to find that all out going forward. As you said, we're headed into the summer. Things get quiet. Who knows what that means? But for the Colts Cover-2 podcast, Joel Erickson and Nate Atkins are going to try to bring you as information as possible when we can get it.